You step into the gym with discipline. You lift heavier than last month. You sweat, you push through pain, and yet when you look in the mirror weeks later, your body looks almost unchanged. This moment creates a quiet confusion that many people never speak about. It feels like the body is betraying effort, but the human body never betrays effort. It only responds to signals, and sometimes those signals are incomplete, distorted, or misunderstood. Growth is not a reward for hard work alone. It is a biological negotiation between stress, recovery, fuel, and time. When people think about muscle growth, they imagine intensity as the primary currency, believing that the more force they apply, the more the body must respond. Yet, biologically, the body does not measure effort in the way the mind does. It measures threat cost and recovery capacity. Resistance training creates a form of controlled damage, a deliberate disruption of muscle fibers, connective tissue, and even neural signaling. And this disruption is interpreted by the body as stress. Stress alone does not trigger growth, because from an evolutionary perspective, stress often meant danger, scarcity, or injury, and the immediate priority was survival rather than expansion. Muscle growth only becomes possible when the body receives a clear message that the stress is past, resources are available, and rebuilding stronger tissue will increase future survival efficiency rather than compromise it. Inside muscle cells, training activates signaling pathways, such as mechanical tension sensors and metabolic stress responses. But these pathways do not complete their work during the workout itself. They merely open a window of possibility. Protein synthesis, satellite cell activation, and structural remodeling occur predominantly after training, often peaking many hours later. If the recovery environment is inadequate, these processes are either blunted or redirected. Instead of adding new contractile proteins, the body focuses on repairing damage just enough to restore baseline function. This is why many people feel sore and tired but look unchanged, because soreness is evidence of damage, not a successful growth. One of the most common recovery errors is excessive training frequency without proportional recovery capacity. Muscles do not operate in isolation. They share systemic resources such as amino acid, hormones, and nervous system output. When training sessions are stacked too closely together, especially at high intensity, the body never exits a stress-dominant state. Cortisol remains elevated, sympathetic nervous system activity stays high, and anabolic hormones lose their effectiveness. In this environment, even perfect workouts fail to translate into visible growth, because the body is constantly managing inflammation rather than building tissue. Volume mismanagement plays a similar role. There's a threshold beyond which additional sets no longer stimulate growth, but instead increase fatigue. This threshold varies between individuals and even fluctuates within the same person, depending on sleep, nutrition, and life stress. When volume exceeds recovery capacity, the body adapts defensively by downregulating growth signals. Muscle fibers become resistant to anabolic cues, not because they are lazy, but because continued expansion under constant stress will increase injury risk. The body always chooses durability over size when forced to choose between the two. Recovery is also deeply connected to the nervous system. Heavy resistance training places a significant load on neural pathways responsible for motor unit recruitment and coordination. When the nervous system is fatigued, muscle activation quality declines even as strength appears stable. Subtle decreases in motor unit firing rates reduce the mechanical tension that drives growth, turning workouts into energy expenditure rather than productive stimulus. Without sufficient neural recovery, muscles are repeatedly trained in a compromised state, reinforcing patterns of stagnation rather than progress. Another overlooked element is connective tissue recovery. Tendons, ligaments, and fascia adapt more slowly than muscle fibers, yet they play a critical role in force transmission. When recovery is insufficient, the body may limit muscle growth intentionally to protect these structures from overload. This protective mechanism operates below conscious awareness, but it influences how much muscle a body is willing to build. People often interpret this as genetic limitation, when in reality it is a feedback loop driven by structural readiness rather than muscle potential. Inflammation is a necessary part of adaptation, but chronic inflammation is an enemy of growth. Training induces acute inflammation that signals immune cells to initiate repair and remodeling. However, when recovery is incomplete, inflammation becomes persistent. Chronic inflammation interferes with insulin sensitivity, disrupts anabolic signaling, and increases muscle protein breakdown. The body, sensing a prolonged inflammatory state, prioritizes stability over expansion. In such conditions, adding more training stress only deepens the problem, even though motivation and discipline remain high. Recovery is not passive rest. It is an active biological process requiring energy, nutrients, and time. During recovery, muscles reorganize their internal architecture, increasing the density and alignment of myofibrils. This process is metabolically expensive. If caloric intake is insufficient or poorly timed, the body lacks the energy required to complete this construction. The workout creates the blueprint, but recovery supplies the materials and labor. Without those resources, the blueprint remains unrealized. Time is another variable that the modern mindset struggles to respect. Muscle tissue adapts slowly compared to the pace of motivation. Visible growth often lags weeks or months behind the behaviors that produce it. When people repeatedly interrupt recovery with new stress before adaptation completes, they reset the process over and over again. This creates the illusion of effort without progress, even though the body is responding exactly as designed. Consistency in recovery allows adaptations to accumulate rather than cancel each other out. Psychological recovery also influences physical recovery more than most people realize. Perceived stress alters hormonal balance, sleep quality, and appetite regulation. When the mind is constantly evaluating progress with impatience or self-criticism, the body remains in a heightened alert state. This internal tension subtly suppresses recovery processes. Growth thrives in environments of predictability and safety, both physical and psychological. When training becomes a source of pressure rather than structured challenge, recovery suffers even if external variables appear optimized. Understanding that muscle growth depends on recovery reframes the entire gym experience. Training is no longer the act of building, but the act of asking the body to build. Recovery is where the body decides whether that request will be granted. When recovery signals are clear, consistent, and supportive, growth becomes an inevitable outcome rather than a mysterious reward. When they are neglected, effort accumulates without translation, leaving people confused, frustrated, and convinced that something is wrong with their body, when in truth the body has been protecting itself all along. When muscle growth fails despite consistent training, nutrition is often reduced to a checklist rather than understood as a biological language the body constantly interprets. Food is not simply fuel burned during workouts. It is information that tells the body whether it should invest energy into building new tissue or conserve resources for survival. From an evolutionary perspective, muscle is metabolically expensive. Maintaining it requires continuous energy, repair, and hormonal support. If the body senses uncertainty in energy availability, it becomes conservative, even if training stress is high. This is why many people train intensely yet remain unchanged, because their nutritional signals never fully convince the body that growth is a safe and sustainable investment. Calories are frequently misunderstood as a purely mathematical concept, but biologically they represent environmental abundance. When caloric intake is insufficient, the body interprets resistance training not as a growth opportunity, but as an added stressor layered on top of scarcity. In this state, adaptive systems shift toward efficiency rather than expansion. Muscle protein breakdown increases to supply energy. Thyroid activity may subtly decline, and non-essential processes are deprioritized. Even small, chronic calorie deficits can suppress growth without producing obvious fatigue, creating a plateau that feels invisible yet persistent. Protein intake receives significant attention, yet its role is often oversimplified. Protein provides amino acids, which are the raw materials for muscle repair and construction, but availability alone does not guarantee utilization. Muscle protein synthesis is a regulated process influenced by hormones, energy status, and training signals. If overall caloric intake is low, protein is frequently oxidized for energy rather than used for tissue building. This leads to the paradox of consuming high-protein diets without experiencing growth, because the metabolic context prevents protein from being directed toward anabolic pathways. Carbohydrates play a crucial but undervalued role in muscle development. They are not merely energy for workouts, but a key regulator of hormonal balance. Adequate carbohydrate intake, reduces cortisol, replenishes glycogen, and enhances insulin signaling, all of which support muscle protein synthesis. When carbohydrates are chronically restricted, especially in individuals training frequently, the body remains in a stress-adapted state. Glycogen depletion reduces training quality, but more importantly, it signals metabolic strain. In such conditions, the body becomes reluctant to allocate resources toward building new muscle mass. Dietary fats are equally essential, though often misunderstood or avoided. Fats are fundamental to hormone production, including testosterone and other anabolic regulators. Extremely low fat intake can subtly disrupt endocrine function without causing immediate symptoms. Over time, this hormonal imbalance reduces training responsiveness and recovery capacity. Muscle growth depends not only on mechanical stimulus, but also on a hormonal environment that supports tissue synthesis. Without sufficient dietary fat, this environment becomes compromised even if training and protein intake are adequate. Meal timing influences how effectively nutrients are used, yet it is less about rigid schedules and more about consistency. The body thrives on predictable patterns. Regular meals stabilize blood glucose, support insulin sensitivity, and reduce unnecessary stress responses. Irregular eating patterns, long fasting windows combined with intense training, or frequent skip meals introduce metabolic unpredictability. When the body cannot anticipate energy availability, it becomes conservative. Muscle growth requires confidence in future resources, not sporadic abundance followed by scarcity. Micronutrients also shape growth outcomes in ways that are often overlooked. Vitamins and minerals regulate enzymatic reactions involved in energy production, protein synthesis, and tissue repair. Deficiencies do not usually halt growth abruptly. Instead, they slow it subtly. Iron status affects oxygen delivery. Magnesium influences muscle contraction and relaxation. Zinc supports hormone function, and B vitamins drive metabolic pathways. When these micronutrients are insufficient, training feels harder, recovery feels slower, and progress becomes inconsistent, even though calorie and protein intake may appear sufficient. Hydration is another silent factor. Muscle tissue is largely composed of water, and cellular hydration status influences protein synthesis signaling. Dehydration increases perceived effort, elevates stress hormones, and reduces nutrient transport efficiency. Chronic mild dehydration, common in active individuals, can suppress growth without obvious symptoms. The body prioritizes maintaining blood volume and organ function over expanding muscle tissue when fluid balance is unstable. Digestive efficiency plays a role that many people ignore. Eating enough food does not guarantee absorption. Stress, poor sleep, highly processed diets, and rushed eating can impair digestion and nutrient uptake. When digestion is compromised, the body may not receive the amino acids, glucose, and fats required for growth even if intake is high on paper. This creates a disconnect between diet plans and biological reality, where effort exists but outcomes do not align. Another critical issue is dietary inconsistency across weeks and months. Muscle growth depends on sustained nutritional support over long periods. Short bursts of disciplined eating followed by lapses disrupt adaptation. The body responds to averages, not intentions. If caloric intake fluctuates significantly, growth signals are repeatedly interrupted. This inconsistency often stems from emotional eating patterns, social pressure, or unrealistic dietary rigidity that eventually collapses. Sustainable growth requires nutrition that fits into real life rather than fighting against it. Psychological perception of food also matters. When eating is associated with guilt, fear, or constant control, stress responses increase. Elevated stress hormones interfere with digestion, nutrient partitioning, and recovery. The body does not distinguish between emotional and physical stress. Both influence anabolic potential. A calm, consistent relationship with food supports growth more effectively than obsessive precision layered with anxiety. Understanding nutrition as a communication system rather than a checklist transforms how progress is evaluated. The body is always listening, interpreting whether resources are stable enough to justify building new tissue. When nutritional signals are clear, consistent, and sufficient, muscle growth becomes a natural response rather than a struggle. When they are fragmented, restrictive, or unpredictable, the body protects itself by maintaining what it has, regardless of how hard the weights are lifted. Sleep is often treated as a passive state that simply fills a gap between training sessions. Yet biologically, it is one of the most active and decisive phases in the muscle-building process. During sleep, the body shifts from outward performance to inward repair, reallocating energy and resources toward restoration. This transition is not optional. It is a fundamental rhythm built into human physiology. When sleep is shortened or disrupted, the body does not merely feel tired. It alters how it prioritizes survival, repair, and growth. Muscle development depends less on how intensely you train and more on how completely the body is allowed to recover in this nightly window of biological recalibration. The deepest stages of sleep are when anabolic processes dominate. Growth hormone secretion rises, protein synthesis accelerates, and immune activity coordinates tissue repair. These processes are sensitive to duration and quality. Fragmented sleep interrupts hormonal pulses, reducing their cumulative effect even if total sleep time appears adequate. This is why people can spend many hours in bed, yet experience poor recovery, because the architecture of sleep has been compromised. Light sleep cannot substitute for deep, restorative phases where muscle repair truly occurs. Sleep deprivation subtly reshapes hormonal balance in ways that directly oppose muscle growth. Testosterone production declines, cortisol levels rise, and insulin sensitivity worsens. These changes do not always produce immediate symptoms, which makes them dangerous in the long term. Training performance may feel acceptable, but recovery capacity erodes quietly. Elevated cortisol increases muscle protein breakdown, while reduced anabolic hormones blunt repair. The body, sensing prolonged stress, prioritizes maintaining essential functions over building additional muscle mass. The nervous system also relies on sleep for recalibration. Resistance training places demands on motor coordination, reaction timing, and neuromuscular efficiency. During sleep, neural pathways are reinforced and refined. When sleep is inadequate, the nervous system remains in a partially fatigued state. This reduces the quality of muscle activation in subsequent workouts. Even if strength levels appear stable, subtle inefficiencies accumulate. Over time, these inefficiencies reduce the mechanical tension placed on muscle fibers, weakening the primary stimulus for growth. Sleep quality influences appetite regulation in ways that directly affect nutrition. Insufficient sleep alters leptin and ghrelin levels, increasing hunger while reducing satiety. This leads to inconsistent eating patterns, cravings for quick energy, and difficulty maintaining nutritional discipline. The resulting fluctuations in energy intake further disrupt recovery. The body experiences not only physical fatigue, but metabolic uncertainty. In such conditions, muscle growth becomes an unstable process, repeatedly interrupted by hormonal and nutritional inconsistencies. Another overlooked consequence of poor sleep is impaired glucose metabolism. Muscles rely on glycogen for training performance and recovery. Sleep deprivation reduces the muscle's ability to store and utilize glucose efficiently. This makes workouts feel harder and recovery slower, even when carbohydrate intake is sufficient. The body becomes less responsive to insulin, diverting nutrients away from muscle tissue. Over time, this reduces the anabolic effectiveness of meals and training stimuli. Inflammation is tightly regulated during healthy sleep. Short-term inflammation from training is resolved during deep sleep, allowing tissues to progress from repair to adaptation. When sleep is restricted, inflammation lingers. Chronic low-grade inflammation interferes with protein synthesis and increases muscle soreness. The body remains in a repair loop without advancing to growth. Many people interpret persistent soreness as proof of effective training, when in reality it is often a sign of incomplete recovery driven by poor sleep. Circadian rhythm alignment also plays a role. The body's internal clock coordinates hormone release, body temperature, and metabolic processes. Irregular sleep schedules disrupt this coordination. Training late at night, excessive screen exposure, and inconsistent bedtimes confuse circadian signaling. Growth hormone release becomes less predictable, and recovery efficiency declines. Even with sufficient total sleep hours, misalignment reduces the biological impact of sleep on muscle repair. Psychological stress and sleep quality are deeply interconnected. Mental tension delays sleep onset and fragments rest. When the mind remains active, the body struggles to enter deep recovery states. This creates a feedback loop where poor sleep increases stress sensitivity and stress further disrupts sleep. Muscle growth suffers not because of a lack of effort, but because the internal environment never fully shifts into restoration mode. The modern tendency to sacrifice sleep for productivity or entertainment is particularly damaging for physically active individuals. Training amplifies the body's need for recovery. Each session creates a debt that sleep must repay. When that debt accumulates, the body adapts by lowering its responsiveness to training. Strength gains slow, muscle growth stalls, and motivation declines. Many respond by increasing training volume, which deepens a deficit rather than resolving it. Sleep also affects how pain is perceived. Inadequate rest lowers pain tolerance and increases sensitivity to discomfort. This changes how people train. Movements become guarded, range of motion decreases, and effort distribution shifts. These subtle alterations reduce training quality and increase injury risk. The body, sensing instability, limits growth to preserve function. Long-term sleep deprivation reshapes body composition. Studies consistently show that insufficient sleep biases weight changes toward fat gain rather than muscle gain, even under resistance training conditions. This reflects the body's strategic allocation of energy under stress. Muscle tissue, being costly to maintain, is sacrificed when recovery is compromised. Fat storage, offering energy security, is favored. Understanding sleep as a biological command center rather than a lifestyle accessory changes how training progress is evaluated. Sleep is not a supplement to training. It is a prerequisite for adaptation. When sleep is protected, consistent, and deep, the body interprets training as a constructive challenge. When sleep is fragmented or insufficient, the same training is interpreted as ongoing threat. The difference between growth and stagnation often lies not in the gym, but in the quiet hours when the body decides whether to rebuild stronger or simply survive. The human body is remarkably efficient at learning, and this efficiency, while essential for survival, often becomes a hidden reason progress in the gym slows or stops. When a training stimulus is first introduced, the body reacts strongly because the stress is unfamiliar. Muscles, connective tissues, and the nervous system all adapt to handle the new demand. Over time, however, the same stimulus becomes predictable. What once required significant biological resources now demands far less. This is not failure, it is adaptation. When workouts remain unchanged for long periods, the body no longer perceives them as a reason to invest in new muscle tissue. Muscle growth depends on progressive overload, but this concept is frequently misunderstood as simply lifting heavier weights. In reality, progression is any increase in meaningful stimulus. This can include changes in volume, intensity, tempo, range of motion, rest periods, or exercise complexity. When these variables remain static, the mechanical tension and metabolic stress that drive adaptation plateau. The muscles perform the work efficiently without triggering the internal signals that initiate growth. The body chooses efficiency because efficiency conserves energy, and conservation is always favored unless change is necessary. Neural adaptation plays a significant role in early strength gains. As the nervous system learns to recruit muscle fibers more effectively, performance improves without corresponding increases in muscle size. This creates a deceptive phase where progress feels strong, reinforcing the belief that the current program is sufficient. Eventually, neural gains plateau. If the training stimulus does not evolve, there is no further reason for the body to build additional muscle. The nervous system has optimized the task, and muscle tissue expansion becomes redundant. Another factor is accommodation at the cellular level. Muscle fibers adapt their metabolic machinery to handle repeated stress. Mitochondrial efficiency improves, buffering capacity increases, and fatigue resistance rises. These changes allow the same workout to be completed with less internal disruption. While this feels like improved fitness, it reduces the growth signal. The cellular environment becomes stable rather than challenged. Growth requires instability followed by recovery. Without new demands, the stimulus lacks urgency. Repetition without variation also affects connective tissue. Tendons and ligaments adapt to loading patterns by reinforcing specific angles and ranges of motion. Over time, this adaptation limits the effectiveness of those movements for stimulating muscle growth. The body reinforces what it already knows, not what it has not yet mastered. Introducing variation challenges these supporting structures in new ways, reactivating growth pathways. Without variation, the system becomes rigid, both physically and neurologically. Rest intervals are another overlooked dimension of progression. Consistently resting the same amount between sets conditions the body to recover within that window. This reduces metabolic stress over time. Adjusting rest periods can dramatically change the internal environment of a workout without altering exercises or loads. Shorter rests increase metabolic demand, while longer rests allow higher force output. Both can reintroduce challenge when intelligently applied. Without such adjustments, training becomes predictable rather than provocative. Volume distribution across the week also matters. Performing the same number of sets on the same days creates a rhythmic pattern the body anticipates. Muscles and the nervous system prepare in advance, reducing the shock of the stimulus. Altering weekly volume, either by cycling higher and lower weeks or redistributing work across sessions, disrupts this predictability. The body responds to disruption with adaptation. Without it, maintenance becomes a default state. Psychological engagement influences physiological response more than many realize. When workouts become routine, attention declines. Movement quality subtly degrades. Range of motion shortens. Tempo becomes rushed, and muscle tension leaks into momentum. These small changes reduce mechanical tension on target muscles. The workout may look the same externally, but internally it is less effective. Variation renews focus, restoring intentional movement and improving stimulus quality. Plateaus often prompt people to add more volume rather than refine stimulus. This can worsen the problem. Excess volume without progression increases fatigue without increasing adaptation. The body responds by reinforcing efficiency, not growth. Strategic progression respects recovery capacity while introducing new challenges. This balance keeps the stimulus within the window where growth is biologically advantageous rather than threatening. Another dimension of stagnation is exercise selection redundancy. Using the same exercises in the same order reinforces specific strength curves. Muscles adapt to the easiest portions of the movement while avoiding weaker ranges. Introducing variations that challenge different parts of the strength curve exposes underdeveloped fibers. This creates a new growth signal without increasing overall workload. Without such variation, certain fibers remain understimulated, limiting overall muscle development. Time under tension is also subject to adaptation. Muscles learn to produce force efficiently within familiar tempos. Slowing or accelerating movement changes the stress profile. Eccentric emphasis, pauses, or controlled transitions increase mechanical tension and metabolic demand. These changes force the muscle to adapt structurally rather than relying on learned efficiency. Without altering tempo, time under tension becomes predictable and less effective. Long-term progression requires planning rather than reaction. Random variation lacks direction, while rigid repetition lacks challenge. Effective adaptation lies in structured change. The body responds best when stress increases gradually and intentionally. Sudden drastic changes increase injury risk and disrupt recovery. Subtle, consistent progression keeps the growth signal alive without overwhelming the system. Understanding adaptation reframes plateaus as feedback rather than failure. The body is signaling that it has mastered the current demands. To grow, it must be given a reason. That reason is not exhaustion, but novelty and precision. When training evolves in response to adaptation, progress resumes naturally. When it does not, the body remains exactly as it is, not because it cannot change, but because it no longer needs to. The relationship between the mind and the body is not symbolic or motivational. It is biochemical. Psychological stress is translated into hormonal signals that directly influence muscle growth, recovery, and adaptation. When the brain perceives threat, pressure, or persistent dissatisfaction, it activates survival pathways that prioritize immediate functionality over long-term construction. This response evolved to protect the organism in times of danger or scarcity, but in modern life it is often triggered by deadlines, comparisons, financial concerns, and internal self-criticism. The body does not distinguish between physical and psychological threats. To the nervous system, both demand caution, conservation, and restraint. Chronic stress elevates cortisol, a hormone essential for short-term energy mobilization, but destructive when persistently high. Cortisol increases muscle protein breakdown, reduces insulin sensitivity, and interferes with anabolic signaling. Even if training and nutrition are well designed, elevated cortisol tilts the internal environment toward tissue loss rather than growth. This effect is gradual and subtle, making it easy to overlook. Progress slows, recovery feels incomplete, and the body appears resistant, not because it lacks potential, but because it is protecting itself. The nervous system plays a central role in this process. Under chronic stress, the sympathetic nervous system remains dominant. Heart rate stays elevated, digestion slows, and sleep quality deteriorates. These changes reduce nutrient absorption, impair recovery, and fragment rest. Muscle growth requires periodic dominance of the parasympathetic state, where repair and restoration occur. Without this shift, the body remains in a constant state of readiness, unable to fully engage in rebuilding tissue. Self-perception and internal dialogue influence this system more than many realize. Persistent self-judgment and impatience create internal pressure that mimics external stressors. When training becomes a measure of self-worth rather than a structured stimulus, emotional investment increases stress load. Each workout carries psychological weight. Missed sessions feel like failure. Slow progress feels like inadequacy. This internal environment undermines recovery even when outward behaviors appear disciplined. Comparison amplifies this effect. Constant exposure to idealized physiques and exaggerated progress narratives distorts expectations. The brain interprets perceived inadequacy as threat, activating stress responses. The body responds by prioritizing resilience over expansion. Muscle growth, being energetically costly, is postponed. In this context, increasing training intensity often worsens a problem by adding physical stress to an already overloaded system. Stress also alters pain perception. Heightened anxiety lowers pain tolerance and increases muscle tension. Movements become guarded, reducing range of motion and fluidity. This changes a mechanical stimulus placed on muscles, decreasing growth potential and increasing injury risk. The body, sensing instability, further limits adaptation. What appears as physical limitation is often a neuroprotective response. Emotional stress affects consistency indirectly. Sleep becomes irregular, appetite fluctuates, and recovery habits deteriorate. These secondary effects compound the primary stress response. Nutrition becomes reactive rather than supportive. Training quality varies unpredictably. The body receives mixed signals, making it difficult to commit resources to growth. Stability, not intensity, is a foundation of adaptation. Another overlooked aspect is identity-based stress. When someone strongly identifies as a gym goer or athlete, progress becomes emotionally loaded. Any plateau threatens identity, increasing stress precisely when patience is required. The body senses this urgency and responds conservatively. Growth requires time, but urgency compresses perception of time, making natural adaptation feel intolerably slow. The placebo and nocebo effects illustrate how belief shapes physiological outcomes. Expectation of progress enhances recovery signals, while expectation of failure suppresses them. This is not motivational rhetoric. It reflects measurable changes in neurotransmitters and hormones. Confidence in the process reduces stress responses, allowing anabolic pathways to operate more effectively. Doubt and frustration interfere with these pathways. Relaxation is not weakness in this context. It is biological permission. When the mind is calm, breathing deepens, heart rate variability improves, and parasympathetic activity increases. These changes enhance digestion, nutrient utilization, and tissue repair. Muscle growth accelerates not because effort increases, but because resistance to recovery decreases. This is why some individuals grow despite moderate training, while others stagnate despite extreme discipline. The difference often lies in internal pressure. Those who trust the process create an environment where growth feels safe. Those who fight their own timeline create internal resistance. The body always chooses safety over size. Mindfulness, emotional regulation, and realistic expectation setting are therefore not separate from physical development. They are integral components of the growth environment. Reducing unnecessary stress does not mean reducing ambition. It means aligning ambition with biological reality. When psychological load decreases, recovery improves, and growth resumes without dramatic changes in training or diet. Ultimately, muscle growth reflects the body's willingness to invest in the future. That willingness depends on signals of stability, abundance, and safety. Chronic stress communicates the opposite. When the mind is constantly rushing, judging, or comparing, the body holds back. When the mind is steady, patient, and supportive, the body responds with adaptation. Growth, in this sense, is not forced through effort, but invited through balance.